thank you for coming here tonight. If you saw the one a month ago, thank you for coming back, and I appreciate everybody being here. And I'm excited to share some of these stories tonight because there's a great deal known about the impact that railroads had on changing the face of America for both good and bad during the 19th century. And we also know quite a bit about the construction of those routes, mostly based on the frequency of newspaper articles that kept their citizens breathlessly up to date with the progress of construction and hyping up the opportunities that would result once those tracks were in place. However, with very few exceptions, there's little known about the surveying of these railroads. Now, surveying itself is a technical process, and don't worry, I'm not going to talk about that here tonight, and that's not what my book is about either. Instead, it's the people who did the surveying and the experiences they had. That's the story. And the diaries and personal letters of Charles Wood Irish are an absolute goldmine. My focus is on a branch of the Chicago and Northwestern called the Dakota Central. And as an interesting overlap, this is the particular rail line that was made famous by Laura Ingalls Wilder in the last several of her Little House books. And because her father, Charles Ingalls, worked for the Dakota Central by way of a contractor while it was being constructed, it's possible, maybe even likely, that Charles Wood Irish and Charles Ingalls spoke with each other at one of two potential railroad camps. And it's even possible that Irish visited with the Ingalls family while they were at the Silver Lake camp. Now, the story of these 2 years is much too big to compress into a short talk. So for tonight, I've shared just a couple of things for you. First, I'm going to talk about what drew me to the diaries and letters, then some context for why this project was taking place. I'm going to introduce you to Irish and his family, and then I'm going to share the portions of the story where Irish's work overlaps with the Ingalls story. And then I'm going to finish up with the hard winter for both Irish and his crew and the Ingalls family. So how did I end up researching these diaries and letters of a railroad surveyor of all things? Excuse me. Well, my first book was a deep dive documentary effort about the hard winter. For those unfamiliar, the hard winter was a particularly vicious season on the northern plains when the first blizzard came in mid-October and the storms came with relative frequency until mid-April. And that period of time is probably best known through Laura Ingalls Wilder's book, The Long Winter. And I wanted to know how the real history of that winter compared with what Wilder wrote about. And as a part of that research, I read the diaries of the surveyor who had determined the route that eventually produced the towns such as Brookings and De Smet and Huron and on to Pierre. And it was during the hard winter, because of the heavy snows, that trains couldn't get to those newly established towns, and they couldn't resupply for food and fuel. And those are the towns that sprung up in the wake of Irish and his men. And for the purposes of this first book, I just wanted to know where Irish and his crew were when that first October blizzard hit so that I could say that the storm had or had not been experienced in their location. Irish's diaries told me their general location, and that was all I needed to know for this book. But we're going to come back to that in a little bit. Now for a bit of context as to why Irish and his men were doing this project. In 1873, the Chicago and Northwestern had reached what today is Watertown, South Dakota. And that's also the track that produced the little stop called Walnut Station that evolved into Walnut Grove, where the Ingalls family lived for a few years and is the basis of the book On the Banks of Plum Creek. And once the tracks had reached into Dakota territory in 1873, Their next goal had been to extend those tracks to the northwest. They wanted to connect to the Northern Pacific, which was a transcontinental railroad that was under construction that was going to link the two coasts by way of the Great Lakes with tracks heading west from the harbor at Duluth, Minnesota. And in September of 1873, railroad officers and major businessmen were on an excursion to the end of those new rails at Watertown, celebrating the opportunities to come and the riches that they envisioned for themselves as a result. On the return trip, however, talk about bad timing. News reached them of the collapse of J. Cook and Company, which is what set off the several-year financial depression that we know of as the Panic of 1873. And during most of the 1870s, the economy just limped along, and the officers reevaluated their options. And by 1878, the Chicago and Northwestern no longer saw that long wished-for link to the Northern Pacific to be their best investment. They now saw greater opportunity heading to the Black Hills, where gold had been confirmed in 1874. And in order to achieve this goal of tracks to Deadwood in the Black Hills, they needed someone to establish a suitable route, and that's where Charles Wood Irish comes in. The officers of the Chicago and Northwestern hired him to do what in his diaries he called the Dakota trip. And by the time he'd been hired to determine the route west from Tracy, he had a pretty impressive set of credentials. He'd been hired by the great John Blair, the father of many Midwestern rail projects, to run a line from the eastern edge of Iowa on the Mississippi River all the way across that state to Council Bluffs on the Missouri River. That was the first line that spanned the state of Iowa and was also folded into that very first transcontinental railroad. He also helped survey the route of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, including work in Colorado and Arizona. And that's the project he was finishing up in the first few weeks of this particular project. Letters Home talked of his aspiration that this Dakota survey could position him to do work for the Northern Pacific. It was the project with prestige of this era. He succeeded and was asked to do that, but unfortunately, due to illness, he had to decline that offer. He moved away from rail surveys just a few years after this particular project when President Cleveland appointed him to the position of Surveyor General for the state of Nevada. He was known as General Irish, but it wasn't a military title. It referred to his time as Surveyor General. He also had been appointed to the chief of the U.S. Irrigation Bureau by President Cleveland, and that required him to live in D.C. for a time. And when that post ended, he returned to Nevada, surveying claims in the gold fields until he died there in 1904. And Irish spent considerable time during this project away from home. However, frequent letters between the family members kept them connected, as did multiple visits where Irish went home to Iowa City or his wife and or daughters visited him for extended periods of time out in Dakota Territory. I'm going to briefly introduce them because they play a big part in this story and they're also worth knowing in their own rights. Mrs. Irish was as comfortable in these camps as she was in her home in Iowa City. And toward the end of the service, Mrs. Irish became stranded with her husband in the new town of Pierre when the snows of the hard winter settled in and the trains could no longer run from the east. And some of the more poignant passages revolved around Mrs. Irish and her safety concerns, not from the drunken desperados that were roaming the streets of Fort Pierre and not from the dangerous weather, but it was her fear of fire in the frontier towns after several close calls. Daughter Lizzie turned about 23 at the beginning of the project, and she was quite independent and had a strong personality in an era when this was not really encouraged for women. Among her many accomplishments was time spent working for both the U.S. Mint and Wells Fargo while living in California. And when she returned to Iowa, she established and ran the Irish Business College, which, according to one source, educated about 12,000 men and women in business skills. And she ran it until she closed the school and retired in 1940 at the age of 84. She lived to be 96. Lizzie's sister Ruth was about 20 when the project began, and she's shown there on the right. She was also independent, but a bit more traditional than Lizzie. She was a teacher until she married at age 28, but remained active as a writer and artist for the rest of her life. And there is an extraordinary letter that Irish wrote to Ruth. She had suffered a terrible heartbreak and was really kind of pondering her future. Basically, the Victorian era father told his adult daughter that she was smart enough and capable enough to have a rich and fulfilling life without marriage. But if she did decide to marry, to wait for someone smart enough to accept her intellect. He told her not to marry just for the sake of marrying. And that's really quite amazing for this era. And these three women were the keepers of Irish's copious documents, and they kept diaries and letters of their own. So there are some archives around Iowa that are quite large because of these three adventurous and unconventional women. So now that we have a sense of what the project was and who Irish and his family were, let's talk about where Irish's work overlaps with the story of the Ingalls family. And because Charles Wood Irish and Charles Ingalls share the same first name, I'm going to try to refer to the surveyor as Irish. And if I say Charles, I should be meaning Charles Ingalls. Now, Wilder initially wrote her story as an autobiography or maybe memoir, published as Pioneer Girl in 2014, and then she drew from that material to craft her novels. The 2 years that Irish spent surveying the Dakota Central corresponds with the time Wilder wrote about in 2 of her books. By the shores of Silver Lake followed the Ingalls family as they moved west from Walnut Grove, Minnesota to the Silver Lake Railroad camp at what became DeSmet in Dakota Territory, and the long winter where we as readers experienced the isolation of that winter alongside the Ingalls family. In the early spring of 1879, while the Ingalls family were still unaware of the change their lives were about to take, Irish and his men were establishing the route away from nearby Tracy. And that brings us to our very first talking point, which is the Big Cut west of Tracy. In Wilder's book, The Long Winter, the blizzards and the railroad companies are the antagonists, the bad guys. And the railroad company is the bad guy because they can't keep snow out of the Tracy Cut. And therefore, trains couldn't get to the new towns to the west, and people were cut off from their supply of food and fuel. Now, this photo is not the Tracy Cut, but it's a good photo to illustrate what a cut is. Simply, a cut is where a hill existed, but the railroad wanted to go straight through that hill, not up and over. So the work crew simply cut out the hill to allow the tracks to go through. During construction, the goal was to get as far west as quickly as possible. So often these cuts were just wide enough to allow for a train to pass through. Great for construction speed and absolutely terrible for ongoing operations, because the more narrow the cut, the more likely it was to trap snow. Blowing snow would get caught in these cuts and it couldn't get out. It would just kind of swirl around in the wind, and then it would settle, and then it would compress into this icy mixture that by the end of the winter was reported to be several feet thick in some of the cuts. After the hard winter, many of the cuts were made wider, such as this one, to help reduce those problems going forward. But When it was built, it was quite narrow. And this is one of my very favorite of Irish's maps, and it shows the area between the town of Tracy and what Wilder made famous as the Big Cut west of Tracy. According to his diary, he made multiple attempts at finding a suitable route through this particular area, and the map shows the two main candidates he eventually settled upon. The first option required cutting through more hills and crossing more wet lands, and the second option stayed on relatively flat ground most of the way, but would require crossing one large marsh and cutting through the side of a more substantial hill. Now, after all of the math was done, taking into account not just construction costs, but ongoing maintenance expenses as well, that second or southern route option is the one that was chosen. Now, the selection of either one of these would not have changed what happened during the hard winter at all, because the trains were actually blocked another 50 miles to the east at Sleepy Eye, Minnesota. Still, I find it really interesting to see the birth of what Wilder had made famous as that big cut west of Tracy. And as Irish and his men were finalizing the suitable route to the immediate west of Tracy, contractors were beginning to arrive in Tracy in preparation for the work to turn Irish's surveyed route into an actual railroad. In the meanwhile, back in Walnut Grove, the Ingalls family was going through a crisis. Their 14-year-old daughter, Mary, was losing her sight. And I'm going to include most of Mary's illness here on this one slide just for simplicity, though it jumps a tiny bit ahead in time here. Oh, excuse me there. Various newspaper accounts followed Mary's illness, the first one appearing on April 24th, until a June 26th piece noted that while she could still tell night from day, what little bit of sight she had left was failing. And it appears that Mary saw her last glimpse of the world sometime between late June and mid-July of 1879. But now we're going to jump backward in time to May again. While Mary still had limited sight, the Ingalls family was struggling financially, and the nearby town of Tracy was rapidly filling up with railroad workers. And as reported in a nearby newspaper, contractors, subs, and sub-subs without number had registered at the hotels during the past few days. Rails for the new road are fast coming in, and track laying will begin in a few days. Quite a large number of tents are to be seen in and about town. And at about this same time, Charles Ingalls received a surprise visit from his sister Dosha. Dosha's husband, Hiram Forbes, was working for railroad contractor D.L. Wells, and he needed someone to run the company store. Dosha offered that job to Charles, but he would have to leave right away while Mary was still recovering from her illness. But Caroline Ingalls reassured her husband that she and Laura could take care of Mary and that he should take the job. Charles would send money home, and then Caroline and the girls would join them somewhere along the new rails, and they would start looking for their new home in Dakota Territory. So Charles headed off to assume his new role working for the railroad. And a note about these major construction camps. The big camps were located every 30 or so miles, give or take, along the route, and they served as headquarters. And when Charles Ingalls accepted this job, he began work at the Lake Benton camp, which was the first of these major headquarter camps. And when grading was sufficiently completed along this first stretch of track, the main camp and store up and moved next to what became Brookings, or what Wilder called the Big Sioux camp. When work in that vicinity was far enough along, the camp again moved to Silver Lake, which is where DeSmet was founded. And that was the last camp established during the 1879 construction season. And when work began again the next spring, another camp was set up at the James River where Huron is today. And as mentioned, the first of these major camps was at Lake Benton, and that is where Charles Ingalls began his work. Now, the construction camp was very likely placed where the surveyors had already established a camping location on the land of an A.W. Morse and John Snyder on the west end of the lake itself. And if you look at the map, you can kind of see a little blue outline around the words Lot 8. And to the right of that is the western end of the big lake itself. So note that unusual shape of that parcel of land. I'm going to put it up here in the corner. Now, times have changed significantly in the nearly century and a half since the railroad camp was here. So I'm going to keep that map up so you can remember the shape of it. And that unique shape makes it really easy to compare to a modern map. And I'm going to switch now to the satellite version. We can see that that lobe of the lake has kind of filled in with cattails. US Highway 75 goes between the lake and that long gone lobe, and we can see the land where the railroad camp would have been. The next photo I'm going to show you, I took when standing in that little gravel parking lot right there looking west, so that I could show you the general view that Charles Ingalls would have had as he was working every day at the Lake Benton camp, although there weren't anywhere near this number of trees back then. I would absolutely love to have an archaeological dig done on this property, see what we can find. After Mary lost her sight, Charles was able to go home and visit his family in mid-July. And while the article indicates that he had taken charge of a gang of men, Ingalls himself listed his duties as more clerical. He was storekeeper, bookkeeper, and timekeeper. And the final mention of Mary's blindness came at the end of July, when it was noted that her parents were planning to take her to St. Paul to have her looked at by a doctor. Despite what was happening at home, he had to return to his job for the railroad, and that would soon take him into Dakota Territory and the next major camp at the Big Sioux River. Now, Hiram Forbes, the husband of Dosha, is the reason the Ingalls family eventually left Walnut Grove, and he appears in a handful of newspaper clippings and possibly one of Irish's diary entries. This first article from June of '79 notes that Forbes was overseeing 140 teams and 400 men who were assigned to the work 10 miles to the east of Lake Benton. A few weeks later, with the grading work nearly done around Lake Benton, Forbes sent most of his crew ahead into Dakota Territory to start their work there. There is also a June 1880, so a full year ahead in the project, where in Irish's diary, he noted that contractor Wells and a Mr. Ford had visited the surveyors' camp, and at the time they were well to the west, almost to the Mississippi or the Missouri River. It's possible, though I haven't been able to prove it or disprove it, but it's possible that Mr. Ford could be Mr. Forbes. Now, this is going to sound absolutely terrible on my part, but some of my favorite of Irish's diary entries had to do with his laments and indignations about mosquitoes in the marshy areas around what today is De Smet. A prominent feature in Wilder's De Smet books is the Big Slough, a giant marshy area surrounding Silver Lake that is the perfect mosquito habitat. And this photo shows the eastern part of the Big Slough to the southeast of De Smet. And this is just a tiny portion of the Big Slough, which continues well to the southwest. So you can imagine looking at this, just how many mosquitoes can make it their home. Even today, when attending the Wilder pageant in July, which is kind of a community theater type of play, having bug spray is absolutely essential for being able to enjoy the festivities. So imagine how maddening it had to have been for Irish and his crew without bug spray. And if you haven't attended events in De Smet, we are looking south across that pageant site, and the trees and that low hill in the background are the northwest corner of the Ingalls homestead land. We also believe that those biggest, oldest looking trees there were planted by Charles Ingalls himself. And to the right or west of this photo is the lobe of the big slough that stood between the homestead property and the town of De Smet. So kind of on the back side of that telephone pole there, those little white buildings, that's De Smet, and I'm standing on the hill on the homestead properties, just so you have a little bit of orientation. And because of that, the big slough is mentioned many times in those latter Little House books. For instance, this is where Laura and Carrie got lost at the beginning of the long winter. So for a little bit of orientation here, that little gray box under the arrow is the quarter section of land that Charles Ingalls homesteaded. He filed for that homestead on February 19th, 1880 in Brookings. But less than 7 months earlier, that exact same area caught the attention of Irish and his crew. As the crew were moving back and forth looking for a clear route for the railroad, they spent the nights of July 7th through 11th on the eastern half of that exact same section. Now, if you look at the detail map in the lower left of the corner, lower left corner, the Ingalls homestead is in the northeast quarter of Section 3, and we only know that Irish and his crew camped on the eastern half of Section 3. But regardless of whether they camped within what became Ingalls land or just to the south of it, the mosquitoes from the big slough found them. Another quick thing I want to point out before we move on is they were also looking at an option that would have taken the tracks to the north. And if they had chosen that route, De Smet itself would be in a different place today. So now that we have a sense of the location, I'm going to read what Irish had to say about their time near the big slough and how the mosquitoes ended up chasing them away. July 7th. Had the worst mosquito fight yet. Hardly an eye closed last night. July 9th. Had a hard night for mosquitoes. Very hot day, 98 degrees at 10 a.m. July 11th. The mosquitoes were so thick that no one got rest in camp last night. Today was intensely hot, 98 degrees for 5 hours. July 12th. What a mosquito night we passed. They swarmed by the millions around our tents. It pains me to hear the men and horses groan all night from such torment. Okay, at this point, they up and they moved. They went to the south bank of Lake Preston, several miles to the east, hoping to get away from the plague. July 14th. Horror of horrors. What a night we have passed. At dark, the mosquitoes came by the millions. The men and horses were cursed by them. July 15th. Got off with camp and came to the divide 8 miles east of Lake Preston. Here we had more mosquito punishment. Then they finally figured it out. July 16th. Had a relief of 15 men, 3 at a time, 2 hours each, to smudge for mosquitoes. Got some sleep. Very hot mosquitoes all day. These few words, even that horror of horrors phrase, cannot begin to describe how miserable the men must have been. In the latter Little House books, Wilder also mentioned being tormented by mosquitoes at the big slough and how they created smudge fires to fight them. Smudging mosquitoes is where damp grass was burned to create a thick smoke that really discourage the mosquitoes from flying around. And this was an excellent use of fire, or at least the smoke from a fire. In a moment, I'm going to talk about a less positive aspect of fire. But first, I need to move Ma and the girls away from Walnut Grove to join Charles in Dakota Territory. According to a newspaper article, they left Walnut Grove on Saturday, September 6th, and Charles recorded their arrival at the Silver Lake camp as Tuesday, December 9th. There's some math problems there, but we're not going to go into that there, but this is what's documented. When I mentioned the mosquito problems the surveyors experienced, they used damp grass fires to create smoke to help deter the pests. And that was a good use of fire. But during the fall of 1879, which was very dry, wildfires ran rampant across this region, and reports of fires frequently showed up in the newspapers. However, they were so frequent that the newspapers were not being specific about date, time, and location. They just said there were more fires, or nothing we could track very easily. In her autobiography, Wilder described a fire that came into the Silver Lake camp, a fire that came sweeping in out of the west after dark and getting into the tall grass in the big slough. It looked for a while as though the camp would be burned, but the men were all out with teams plowing furrows to turn the fire, setting back fires and whipping out little fires with grain sacks. They headed it around the camp, and it went roaring around on the other side of the lake and away to the east. On September 24th, Irish and his men were just a few miles to the northwest of Volga, near the town of Oakwood. So they were northwest of Brookings or northeast of De Smet. They were doing a side project for the Chicago and Northwestern because at this point their real work was out by the Missouri River. But here they were over not far from Brookings. And Irish wrote that at about 1 p.m. that day, a fierce fire came rampaging in from the northwest. The men had a hard fight all afternoon to save their camp and themselves. The fire also burned into the edge of the town of Oakwood, where the citizens had a narrow escape. It's impossible to know whether Wilder's wildfire that hit at night from the west correlates to Irish's fire that came in from the northwest at 1 p.m. It is possible geographically and chronologically in time. But at the same time, there were so many fires that fall that they may have taken place weeks apart, but I still include them because of that shared terrifying experience within a similar time frame and location. Now, this last overlap is my very favorite. On the night of October 25th, 1879, Irish, his wife Abby, and railroad officer John Blunt arrived at the Silver Lake camp for a 2-night stay while they were out reviewing the route options to the west of De Smet. Irish noted in his diary that they stayed at the engineer's house at De Smet. The engineer's house was the railroad's name for what Wilder called the surveyor's house, because the terms surveyor and engineer were used fairly interchangeably, though there is a little bit of a nuance. And of course, the surveyor's house is where the Ingalls family lived from December of 79 into the mid-spring of 1880, after Charles Ingalls agreed to live in the building throughout the winter to guard the railroad company's property and tools. And that's accounted for in Wilder's book, By the Shores of Silver Lake. And I would not be at all surprised if the gregarious Charles Ingalls and the similarly gregarious Charles Wood Irish, either in their official capacities or simply as residents of this railroad camp, spoke with each other. Perhaps Mrs. Irish would have visited with the few other women in camp, and that would have included Caroline Ingalls. In Wilder's autobiography, she also wrote about how others would frequently come to eat with the Ingalls family because the food was better. She wrote, The company men, when passing through, came too, and so Ma and I were very busy. And that makes it possible, maybe even likely, that Irish, his wife, and Officer Blunt were served their meals by Caroline and Laura. Also, Wilder remembered that an Irish baby was ill and that her mother Caroline had tended to that patient. Irish did not indicate any illness for himself or his wife at this time, something that he did tend to elaborate on in his diary when he wasn't feeling well. So while it's maybe unlikely that the Irish baby was actually an adult Mr. or Mrs. Irish, it is interesting to contemplate that Irish may have been a name, not a nationality. This final item is not directly an overlap with the Ingalls story, but it is what ties my two books together. I undertook this project about Irish's diaries because I was so intrigued by the fact that when the first storm of the hard winter descended on those newly established towns east of the Missouri River, Irish and some of his men were well to the west, almost to the Black Hills, and they experienced that first October blizzard a day earlier than the residents of De Smet, and they were in canvas tents. At the time of the storm, the Ingalls family were living in their homestead shanty south of town. And as Wilder described it, it had been a warm fall and the storm took people by surprise. And that storm had been so worrisome that Pa moved his family into town to live in the store building for the rest of the winter. That first storm was indeed quite something. This photo is taken from a rail yard in southern Minnesota, not that far from Tracy and Walnut Grove, and it shows how much snow fell from that very first storm. There'd been no snow on the ground when it started, so no wonder Pa was worried. Now, that blizzard is traditionally noted as having begun on October 15th, 1880, based on newspaper reports in the eastern part of this region. But I mentioned that Irish and his crew experienced the blizzard a day earlier because they were well to the west. This dot is about where De Smet is. The Missouri River is here in the middle, and Irish and his crew were out exploring this area with the dot showing their camp location. On October 13th, 1880, 4 of Irish's men were sick, a situation he blamed on the villainous water they were drinking here in this area, and that also gives you an idea of what kind of sick they were. At 2 p.m. that October 13th, it was 80 degrees with a strong wind, and Irish sent 2 of his men back to a supply camp that was about 20 miles to the southeast to bring back food. They were running low on provisions. A rain developed, and by midnight, it was snowing. So again, 80 degrees at 2 p.m., snowing by midnight. And throughout the 14th, the men just hunkered down in their tents. By the end of the first day of that historic storm, Irish closed his diaries with "The sick are worse and the camp comfortless. We have all we can do to keep warm in this gale." The storm raged for several days, and that time yielded some interesting diary entries and letters home. And this episode was so intriguing to me and did such a nice job of tying my two projects together that I pretty soon wanted to see exactly where the men had spent that October blizzard. There is a several-year odyssey involved with trying to find it that was complicated by the pandemic. But when the pandemic ended, I was finally able to get back into the Special Collections Library in Iowa City, and I was able to see the maps that Irish had drawn of this area, but I had to get special permission because they were so fragile. And this is Irish's map of that area, and it shows the entire region from the Missouri River to where the Belle Fourche River empties into the Cheyenne, or also called the Forks. Irish and his crew We're here in this area with Irish and a portion of the crew at a scouting camp along Gap Creek here in the upper left of the box. And that supply camp I mentioned is in the lower right. And again, he had sent a couple of people back to that supply camp. So on top of dealing with the sick men and the blizzard, he was pretty worried about the safety of those he had sent off just before the storm hit. Now, zooming in on the map, Irish very kindly drew this tiny little collection of squares showing the camp location I had so desperately wanted to find. We then correlated that drawing with modern topographical maps. I make it sound easy, but it was several months of work and eliminating candidates until we found the right one. But once we found it, Irish's drawing overlaid perfectly with modern topographical maps. So then we went back out to western South Dakota along with a friend and his drone. And we sent the drone aloft, entered in those coordinates. And this particular photo was taken we sent it aloft and it took its picture. So we are standing on a ridge looking north. The river is about 4 miles away from us here. We're standing on a ridge at about the tip of that arrow, and the camp location is in that little oval. The Cheyenne River there is at the top. The forks where the Belle Fourche comes into the Cheyenne is at the upper left, but it's not visible in the photo. Okay, so now we sent the drone a couple miles to our north, and this photo was taken just north of the campsite, looking back south. The camp area is here within this rectangle. And just so you can reorient, since we've flipped directions, we're parked back along the ridge there where that arrow is. Now we're going to watch a video from that drone flight. And the video begins by looking north to show the Cheyenne River, but then it's going to spin to look south and fly back to the camp location. And it is here in this protected little valley that the men were trapped for about a week by that first blizzard of the hard winter. And I want you to imagine it not in this lush green loveliness of mid-June, but with howling winds, blowing snow, and sub-zero temperatures. Now, that winter was truly horrific. And while Irish did try to keep the work going through the first few months of blizzards and sub-zero temperatures, the survey was finally called to a halt in mid-February, at which point Irish and his crew, just like the Ingalls family and tens of thousands of others, could only wait out the calendar until spring. And while the Ingalls family were struggling through the winter about 140 miles to the east in their freezing store building on De Smet's Main Street, Irish and his wife were living in the second story of the brand new depot building in Pierre. Now, the photo on the left of the Ingalls store was taken many years after the hard winter, after the building had been moved to the back of its original lot and rotated to face north instead of south. But I like to show it because it shows just how small that building really was. And despite both of these two towns being developed during the 1880 construction season, Pierre, because it was the end of these brand new rails, it had a it had a lot of warehouses that were well stocked. It was also on the Missouri River, which was regularly plied with steamboats. So Pierre was extra well supplied when the winter set in. So they were not anywhere near as destitute as the people in the smaller towns to the east, like De Smet. At least not until a great ice dam burst on the Missouri River in late March and scoured away most of those well-stocked warehouses on both sides of the river. The town in the foreground on that right picture is Pier, but if you look across the river, you can see Fort Pier on the opposite shore. And both towns were severely impacted by this flood. And Irish's account of that event is absolutely fantastic. Now we are going to jump ahead in time to when Rose Wilder Lane and Lizzie Irish were quite likely just mere blocks or less apart from each other. In the fall of 1932, Rose, who was the daughter of Laura and Almanzo Wilder, began a 2.5-month driving trip, which started and ended in Mansfield, Missouri, where the Wilders lived. Rose was visiting the places her father had lived in his youth, such as Spring Valley, Minnesota, and Malone, New York. The book Farmer Boy, which is about Almanzo's childhood, was published a year after this particular road trip that Rose took. One of the sites visited along her route was Iowa City, where the Irish family had generational roots. And in her trip journal, Rose described the town as a charming city built around the university with an air of learning. And in a later Saturday Evening Post article, she noted she'd especially enjoyed her time there, which is pretty impressive considering that she had seen a decent part of the world already by that point in time. Mrs. Irish had died about 7 years before Rose's trip at the age of 87. Daughter Ruth was 73 at this time and was living in Davenport, Iowa, which is about 60 miles to the east of Iowa City. But daughter Lizzie, who was approaching 77 years old when the almost 46-year-old Rose wandered through town, was still running her business college and would for another 8 years before she retired. And I really wonder what kind of small world conversations could have happened between the two women if they had known about each other that day, since odds were they were on the same block at some point in that afternoon because Lizzie's college was in the main downtown of Iowa City. One last thing I want to mention is why my book is named We Suffered Much. After all, there's kind of a semi-unwritten rule that you don't want to have a negative book title. But the phrase "we suffered much" popped up a lot in the diary entries. Each of the entries shown here on these pages has either the exact phrase or a similar lament. The men were conducting their work in all weather conditions, from temperatures well below 0 to well above 100, air dry in the winter and quite humid in the summer, and every type of precipitation. And they were also living in canvas tents most of that time, including the worst of the winter weather. There was terrible water, illness, a death, an attempted mutiny, horses that got away time and time again, a horse that accidentally killed itself, something the crew grieved so deeply that they held a funeral for the horse. There were multiple accidental shootings and, oh my gosh, those mosquitoes. So I have shared just a little bit about what Irish's project was and some of their experiences, along with how that time overlapped with some of what Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote about in 2 of her novels. And before I unshare my screen, for the people who were here last month, and we were talking about the way the cuts were blocked, and part of it was because dirt and ice had mixed together, making this thing that was just so hard to break through. And I mentioned that we called it snert, and a couple of people had expressed interest in that term and the concept. Well, a day or 2 later, my husband and I were out driving around and there was some snert. We do not have a lot of snow this winter, but what little bit was there was worth stopping and taking a picture because you can see we haven't had a lot of snow, so the dirt is exposed to all of the winds. And so you can see how it gets on top of the snow, and the chemical, I don't know what causes it, but that combination of dirt mixed in with the snow when it melts into an ice makes something that is very hard to break through and chop away. So I thought for those of you who were here last month, I would throw in a snert photo as well. So thank you for listening. And I'm going to unshare my screen now and go into gallery view so I can see people. If you have questions, go ahead and unmute yourself. I will also be kind of trying to look in the chat, but I may miss things. So go ahead and unmute yourself if you can and ask, or I'll keep an eye on the chat. Okay, Eddie says, I've been astounded how long regular snow takes to melt in the Midwest. Yes. Although at the same time, here we are, approaching late February, and the sun, the strength of the sun is starting to ramp up. So even though the air may be around 2 degrees, when the sun is hitting directly on you, it feels fantastic. Okay, it looks like people are not allowed to unmute. So if you can just type the questions. Did they live up north? Can you expand on that question a little bit? Yep, lots of snert in North Dakota. Okay, did they live up north in Malone? The Wilder family did. Laura Ingalls never lived in New York, but Almanzo's childhood years were spent in Malone, New York. And then that family moved to Spring Valley, Minnesota, where he kind of spent his teenage years until he and his brother Royal and sister Eliza Jane moved out to the DeSmet area. Thank you, Susan. Okay, I'm reading. Eddie says, I call her Eddie because I know Eddie, I'm sorry. When Pa pranks that guy who was trying to renege on land and he says the other chap is a surveyor or I'll eat my hat. I forgot that detail. Maureen, yes, it is being recorded and it will be shared. It might be check back with the library because I know that the one I did in January is available to watch and this one will be too. No, I don't know who that person might have been. I'd have to reread if she identified them. I thought it was that the person who was trying to run off with Mr. Boast's horse? What caused the mutiny? There is an excellent story around the mutiny. I'm going to try and do a short version of it, but essentially starting in around, I think November of 1879. So their very first full winter, they had rented a log cabin on the banks of the Missouri River from a local person who was living there. But there's more of a story here, but essentially that person, kicked them out in February. And there was a big hullabaloo all about that. But when they got kicked out of the log cabin, the very same day, he uncovered a mutiny among the crew. And that's all he talked about. He just said, I uncovered a mutiny and fired one and put several others on notice. And I just find it really interesting, the correlation between them getting kicked out and something making the crew very unhappy. And I suspect maybe it was the prospect of losing their lovely log cabin, which they had spent time putting, they built bunks, they put in they made it their own inside, and they'd put a lot of work into it. And even though that winter was not a terribly harsh winter, it is still winter on the northern plains, and it was cold outside, and there were frequent storms, and they had to go back out and live in their tent. So I suspect that is what caused the mutiny. Thank you for the kind words about the quilt. I made that. It's all hand pieced, but machine quilted. And it hangs in honor of a good friend of mine who was also a quilter who we lost to ALS 6 months after her diagnosis. So I keep that there in her memory. So thank you. Yes, thank you. And then there's something in the Q&A. I made the quilt behind me. So thank you. I do a lot of art quilting. I do a lot of traditionally quilting, a lot of machine quilting. And like I said, I love kaleidoscopes. And so it's a kaleidoscope based pattern. So it's all fussy cut and hand pieced. And I had a lot of fun doing it. Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here. I appreciate it. And if you were here both times, thank you for coming back. And somebody says, do you have any other Laura Ingalls Wilder research projects in mind? Yes, there's a couple of things that I have in the works. The quarterly magazine put out by the South Dakota State Historical Society. I am working on a big article for them that will come out in about 2 years. It will be a single topic issue. So the entire edition will be one large article that is Ingalls based. And in a couple of months, the same publication will have a shorter article that follows Lizzie and Ruth Irish's trip when they came out and spent about a month in Dakota with their parents during the survey. So those are kind of two of my related projects coming up. Seems like the Irish diaries are a tremendous resource. Why were they not discovered and made use of earlier? I have no idea, because truly they are amazing. And I only looked into 2.5 years worth of what appears to be a couple of decades of his stuff. And I'm trying very hard not to make eye contact with that, because I could see myself having a lot of fun going down into rabbit holes with some of his other projects. And I have so many other things on my plate. What little house event or home site is my favorite, and which do you recommend? Well, that's a little bit of a subjective thing, because what I like, the next fan might like different things. Personally, though, I just have a connection with De Smet. I live in southern Minnesota. I live exactly 2 hours from Walnut Grove to my west, Pepin to my east. I can get to Burr Oak in the same amount of time, down to Iowa. So within a very short time, I can get to a lot of the home sites. But there's something about De Smet that just calls me. And if I hone in specifically, it's the surveyor's house. There's just something about the surveyor's house. And that was before I became so invested in Irish's story. But De Smet also has Pa's Big Green Book. They had the real book that was the Ingalls family's copy. And then my other artifact is Pa's Fiddle down at the Missouri site in Mansfield. So, oh, what is the Big Green Book? In several of the novels, and especially in The Long Winter, they talk of Pa reading from his, oh gosh, Eddie, help me with the name. It has a name in the book that's different than the name on the cover, but it's the Big Green Book of Animals. So about lions and giraffes and I just can't remember the details of it, but that's Pa's Big Green Book. And the copy that they all sat around and read from is in DeSmet. Yes, Wonder of the Animal or Polar, something like that. Yes. Oh. And truly, all of the sites are amazing to go to. For those of you out in the Massachusetts area, the site at Malone, New York was my last one to get to. And I really hadn't thought I'd ever get there. And when I had the opportunity, it rose right up to the top there. It is so well done, and you can stand in that house and see Farmer Boy played out in front of you, either in the house or out in the yards where they've reconstructed barns. And it is an amazing experience. And I am so glad that I had the opportunity to do it. But all of the sites that I've been to have been worth going to. So, yes, Maureen says she's been there twice and you really felt it there. Yeah, Polar and Tropical Worlds is the name of the Big Green Book. Oh. Which fits the Midwest because it can be polar and it can be tropical, all within a month even. Or day, yes. All right, well, thank you, everybody, for coming here tonight. I hope you enjoyed and I appreciated the questions. And I'm going to go ahead and end. And you should probably be able to check in with the library themselves to get the link to tonight's recording and or the one from July. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.